Tonight, before this journey begins, I want to ask you a simple question. Have you ever tried so hard to find peace that the trying itself became the very thing keeping it away? Perhaps you've pushed yourself to be more patient, more disciplined, more productive, more forgiving, and yet somehow, the harder you strained, the further calm seemed to drift beyond your reach. If that feels familiar, you are not alone. More than 25 centuries ago, a weary monk named Sona found himself asking the very same question. He believed that awakening belonged to those who endured the most, who pushed the hardest, who never rested. By the time he realized something was wrong, his feet were bleeding, his body was exhausted, and he was quietly preparing to give up. What happened next became one of the most enduring teachings in all of Buddhism. But tonight is not only Sona's story. It is also the story of a farmer who never tried to conquer the forest, a gatekeeper who learned to recognize anger before it entered his home, a woodcutter who discovered that a single mindful breath could change the course of a fire, an old woman who planted seeds where everyone else saw only barren ground. Each of them discovered a different face of what the Buddha called right effort. Not forcing, not giving up, but learning day after day how to live with the heart tuned like a well-played instrument, never pulled so tight that it breaks, never left so loose that it forgets its song. So wherever you are tonight, there is nothing you need to achieve, nothing you need to prove. Only allow yourself to listen. And perhaps, somewhere between these stories, you may begin to hear your own life a little differently. Now, let us begin where the music first lost its tune. Before he was known as a teacher, Sona was known as a man who did nothing by halves. He walked into the forest the way other men walked into battle, jaw set, eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. When he decided to become a monk, he did not simply practice. He punished himself with practice. He paced the stone paths of the monastery until his feet split and bled, then wrapped them in cloth and kept walking, telling himself that pain was proof of sincerity, that a path without suffering could not possibly be the true one. He sat through the coldest hours of the night without a blanket, listening to the wind test the shutters, feeling the cold settle first into his hands, then his knees, then somewhere deeper he could not name. He told himself that comfort was the enemy of awakening, that every shiver was a small victory over the self he was trying to burn away. Months passed this way. Sona grew thin. The other monks noticed the hollowness gathering beneath his eyes, the way his robes had begun to hang from him, as though borrowed from a larger man. Some admired his discipline. Others, quietly, began to worry, though none said so directly. For who were they to question a man trying so visibly hard to be good? And yet the peace he was chasing seemed to retreat exactly as fast as he pursued it, like a shadow that lengthens the closer the sun comes to setting. He would sit in meditation and feel not stillness, but a kind of gritted, white-knuckled endurance, counting the minutes until he could stop, ashamed of himself for counting at all. One evening, unable to sleep, unable to sit, unable to walk another step on his ruined feet, Sona allowed himself a single thought he had forbidden until now. Perhaps I should return to the life I left. At least there, I could give what wealth I have to the poor, and live a life of some small good instead of failing at this. He did not act on the thought, but it lodged in him the way a splinter lodges beneath skin, small and impossible to ignore, throbbing faintly with each movement, no matter how he tried to hold still around it. The Buddha found him sitting at the edge of the forest that night, looking out at nothing in particular, his bandaged feet drawn up beneath him, his shoulders curved with an exhaustion that went past the body. "Oh, Sona," the Buddha said, settling nearby without ceremony, without any of the gravity Sona had expected such a meeting to carry. "Before you left your home, I am told you played the lute rather well." Sona was startled by the ordinariness of the question, so far from the crisis churning in his chest. "I did," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Tell me, when the strings of your lute were too tight, what sound did they make?" "A harsh sound," Sona said, remembering almost against his will the particular ugliness of an over-tightened string. Sharp and thin, sometimes they would snap, and the whole instrument would go silent at once, as though startled. "And when the strings were too loose?" "No sound at all worth hearing, just a dull, lifeless thud, like a stone dropped into mud." "And when the strings were neither too tight nor too loose?" Sona was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet, something in his chest loosened slightly, unbidden. "Then the music was true," he said. "Then it was beautiful. I remember. My mother would stop whatever she was doing in the next room just to listen." The Buddha said nothing further for a while. He let the frogs sing in the reeds nearby, let the wind move through the trees in long, unhurried breaths, let the silence do what words could not have done nearly so gently. Then he said simply, "So it is with effort, Sona. Too tight, and you exhaust and torment yourself until something in you threatens to snap the way an over-tightened string snaps. Too loose, and you drift and accomplish nothing, dull and formless as a note that never rings. Effort, like music, must be tuned, not once and not forever after, but again and again each time you sit down to play." Sona sat with this for a long time. He thought of his bleeding feet, his sleepless nights, the harsh sound of a string pulled past its limit, and beneath all of it, the memory of his mother pausing in the next room to listen to something true. He loosened the string that night, not by abandoning his practice, but by no longer punishing himself for being human within it. He rested when rest was needed, without the familiar voice in him insisting that rest was betrayal. He walked when walking served him, and sat when sitting served him, and slowly, without the frantic grasping that had governed him before, the music of his practice began, for the first time in longer than he could remember, to sound true, not loud, not dramatic, but true, the way a well-tuned string simply is, without needing to prove anything further to anyone. In the years that followed, when younger monks asked him how he had endured those difficult early months, he rarely told the whole story. He would simply ask them, as he had once been asked, "Have you ever played an instrument?" And in their answer, he would begin, patiently, to teach them the same lesson the forest had once taught him, that the path does not reward those who strain the hardest, but those who learn with time and honest attention, exactly how tightly the string must be held to finally let the music through. There was a particular evening, many years after that first conversation, when Sonar found himself walking past the same stretch of forest where he had once sat with bleeding feet. Now an old man himself, his steps slower but no longer burdened by the frantic urgency that had once driven them. He noticed a young novice sitting at almost the exact same spot, staring out at the trees with the same hollow, sleepless look Sonar remembered so well from his own reflection, decades ago, in the still water of a nearby stream. He did not approach immediately. He simply sat some distance away, as the Buddha had once sat beside him, and let the evening settle around them both, the frogs beginning their chorus in the reeds, the last birds finding their roosts, the particular hush that comes just before full dark. After a long while, the novice noticed him, and something in the old monk's calm presence seemed to invite a question that had been building in the young man for weeks. "Master," the novice said quietly, "how do you know when you have found the right tension? I fear I am always either too tight or too loose, and never anywhere between." Sona smiled, recognizing his own old fear in the question. "You do not find it once and keep it forever," he said. "You find it this evening, and then tomorrow evening you must find it again, because you are not the same person tomorrow that you are tonight, and neither is the string. This is not a failure of your practice. It is simply what practice is." The novice seemed to relax slightly at this, as though some invisible weight had shifted. Sonar did not say anything further. He simply sat with him a while longer, letting the silence itself continue the teaching that words alone could not finish, until the first stars appeared above the tree line, and it was time, at last, for them both to return. In a small farming village at the base of a mountain, where the mist did not fully lift from the valley floor until well past sunrise, there lived a farmer named Kem, whose field bordered a stretch of wild forest. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, before even the roosters had finished their first uncertain calls, Kem walked the edge of his field with a simple wooden hoe, its handle worn smooth by decades of the same grip. He cleared away the vines and weed shoots that had crept in from the forest overnight, working the same modest stretch of border he had worked every morning for as long as anyone in the village could remember. He did this whether the encroachment was heavy or light. Some mornings after a wet week, the vines had crept a full arm's length into his field, and the work took him until well past sunrise. Other mornings, in the dry season, there was barely anything to clear at all, and he walked the border more out of habit than necessity, his hoe skimming lightly over ground that needed almost nothing from him that day. A traveler passing through one spring morning, dust still on his sandals from the road, stopped to watch him work, curious at the quiet, unhurried rhythm of it. "You clear the same edge every day," the traveler observed, leaning against a fence post. "Does the forest not simply grow back?" "It does," Kem said, not pausing his work, his hoe moving in the same practiced arc it had moved in for 30 years. "Then why not clear it once, thoroughly, and be done with it? Why not build a wall or burn back the tree line entirely so you need not return each morning like this?" Kem straightened at last, resting on his hoe for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of a sun-browned hand. "I have tried that once, long ago," he said, and something in his voice suggested this was a story he did not often tell. "I spent an entire season burning and cutting far past my field's edge, thinking I would finally be free of this work forever. My back ached for weeks, my hands blistered and split, and when it was done, I felt for the first time in my life that I had finally won something against the forest. And the forest does not forget so easily," Kem said, a small, rueful smile crossing his weathered face. "It returned twice as thick the following year, in places I had never even needed to clear before, as though my violence against it had only taught it to grow back harder, angrier, in a dozen new directions I had not thought to guard, and I had exhausted myself for nothing, and scorched soil that once fed good things, soil that took 2 more seasons to recover its color." He gestured to the field behind him, even rows, healthy green stalks catching the early light, a quiet order that seemed almost effortless from where the traveler stood. "Now I simply come each morning," Kem said. "A little labor, given consistently, keeps the wildness at the edge where it belongs. I do not fight the forest as though it were an enemy to be finally defeated. I do not ignore it either, pretending it will simply stay away out of some goodwill it does not possess. I simply meet it every day at the border between what is cultivated and what is not, and I ask no more of myself than that." The traveler looked at the tree line, dense and patient at the field's edge, and then at the rows of even green stalks behind Kem, and understood something about labor that has no dramatic ending, only faithful repetition. A labor that asked each morning, only for a small ordinary return and nothing more. This is the shape of what the old teachings call right effort. Not a single heroic push meant to end a struggle forever, and not a passive hope that the wildness will simply stay away on its own if one simply wishes hard enough, but a soft and steady meeting, morning after morning at the edge of the self. There are 4 kinds of clearing the old texts describe, though Kem himself may never have counted them so precisely, may never have needed to, having learned them instead through the simple wisdom of his hoe and his field and 30 patient years. To prevent what has not yet grown from growing, to remove what has already taken root before it spreads, to plant what is good where nothing yet grows, to tend what is already growing so it does not wither. 4 kinds of morning labor. No wall, no fire, only the hoe and the field, and the willingness to return again and again, without the need to ever finally declare the work complete. The traveler stayed in the village longer than he had planned, curious to see whether Kem's quiet method would hold up over the coming weeks. He watched the farmer through a stretch of unusually heavy rains when the vines crept further than usual and the morning's work stretched well past what Kem's usual hour allowed. He watched him too through a dry spell when the border needed almost nothing and Kem simply walked its length in the cool morning air, sometimes pausing to examine a stalk of rice more closely, sometimes simply standing at the field's edge for a while before returning to his home. "You never seem discouraged," the traveler observed one such quiet morning. "Even on the days the forest gains ground faster than you can clear it." Kem considered this as he leaned on his hoe, watching the mist finally begin to lift from the low corner of the field. "Discouragement is its own kind of forest," he said. "If I let it grow unchecked in me, the way I would never let the vines grow unchecked at my border, it would take far more from me than any season's rain ever could. So I clear that too, each morning, the same way. A little attention given before it can take root too deeply." The traveler left the village some days later with a question he had not expected to carry away with him. Not what he might build, but what he might simply tend morning after morning, without ever needing the tending to end. At the entrance to an old monastery, where the stone steps had been worn into gentle curves by centuries of sandaled feet, stood a gate, and at the gate sat an elderly monk whose only duty, for the last 20 years of his life, was to watch who came and went. A young novice, newly arrived from a distant province, found this assignment strange. He had imagined monastic life as a ceaseless pursuit of scripture and stillness, not the quiet, seemingly unremarkable task of simply sitting beside a door. "Why would anyone dedicate a life to sitting at a gate?" he asked another senior monk one evening as they walked together through the courtyard. "Surely there are more important things to attend to: study, meditation, service to the community." The senior monk smiled, the particular smile of someone who had once asked the very same question. "Have you ever watched him work?" The novice admitted he had not paid much attention, had walked past the old gatekeeper a dozen times without truly seeing him. That evening, he did. He sat some distance away and watched the old gatekeeper as travelers passed through the fading light, a merchant complaining loudly about the price of goods in the nearby town, hoping perhaps for sympathy or argument, a woman offering gentle, sincere praise for the monastery's gardens, a younger monk from a rival order making a barbed comment about the gatekeeper's own community, clearly hoping to provoke some defensive reply. The gatekeeper listened to all of it with the same still, unhurried expression. He did not chase after the rude comments to correct them, did not swell with pride at the praise, did not rise to the provocation with any visible resistance at all. He simply noted what arrived at the gate, the way a man might note the weather, and let what did not belong pass by, unentered, without needing to slam any door against it. Later, once the gate had quieted and the last travelers had gone, the novice approached him directly. "Does nothing bother you?" he asked. "Do unkind words never take root after so many years of hearing them?" The old monk considered this for a long moment, his eyes following the last light fading behind the western hills. "They arrive," he said finally. "I do not pretend otherwise, and I would not wish you to believe I have become some kind of stone that words simply bounce off of. A thought of anger arrives at the rude merchant's tone. A wish to defend myself arrives at the rival monk's comment. But I have learned, slowly, over many years, to notice them the moment they appear at the gate, before they have walked further into the house and made themselves at home by the fire, before they have had the chance to invite their friends in as well. How do you notice so quickly? It seems to happen in you almost before it happens in me." "Practice," he said simply. "The same way you would come to recognize a neighbor's particular footstep on the path or the particular creak of a door you have opened 10,000 times without ever consciously counting. I have simply spent enough time at this gate to know unwholesome guests by the sound of their approach, long before they knock. The slight quickening of the pulse, the tightening behind the eyes, the old familiar rehearsal of a retort forming before the words have even fully landed. And once you notice them, I simply do not open the door, the old monk said. That is all. I do not need to fight them off, or shout them down, or prove to them that they have no business here. I only need to notice that they have arrived and decline gently to let them in any further than the threshold. This is the first labor of right effort, to prevent what has not yet arisen from arising, not through forceful denial, which only exhausts the one denying, and not through anxious vigilance, which mistakes fear for readiness, but through the quiet, hard-won familiarity of one who has simply sat at their own gate long enough to know its visitors before they even arrive. The young novice took up his own turn at the gate some months later, assigned for a season while the old monk recovered from a mild illness. He found the work far harder than he had expected, having imagined after his conversation with the old gatekeeper that the practice would come easily once understood in principle. It did not. He caught himself, on his very first day, deep in an irritated argument inside his own mind with a merchant who had said nothing particularly unkind at all. An argument the merchant himself would never even know had taken place. He returned to the old monk that evening, frustrated with himself. I understood what you told me, he said, and still I could not stop the door from opening before I noticed. The old monk, still weak from his illness but glad for the company, only nodded slowly. You noticed that the door had opened, he said. That is not nothing. Before you sat at the gate yourself, you would not have noticed it at all. You would have simply lived inside the argument for the rest of the day, certain it was a fact of the world rather than a guest you yourself had let inside. Noticing the door is already open is the beginning of learning to close it sooner next time. It does not happen all at once, and it did not happen all at once for me either. In all my years at that gate, the novice took some comfort in this, though not as much as he had hoped. But he returned to the gate the next morning regardless, a little more attentive than the day before, and a little more forgiving of himself for the mornings when attention, however sincerely offered, still came too late. There was once a woodcutter named An who was known throughout his village for his terrible temper, a reputation he had earned honestly over many years of small explosions that left those around him treading carefully in his presence. It did not take much to provoke him. A poorly stacked pile of wood, a comment made in jest that landed wrong, a long day in the heat with too little water. When his anger came, it came like a fire through dry brush, fast, consuming, indifferent to what stood in its path, and leaving behind a landscape he did not recognize once it had passed, strewn with the ash of words he could not take back. One day, after a particularly fierce outburst, over nothing more than a dropped basket of kindling, that frightened his young daughter into hiding behind her mother's skirts, An caught sight of her small, frightened face peering out from behind the cloth, and something in him cracked open with a shame deeper than any he had felt before. He sought out an old teacher who lived at the edge of the village, known throughout the region for her calm, though he had always privately dismissed such calm as something people were simply born with, or without. "I do not know how to stop the anger once it begins," he confessed, sitting heavily on the low stool she offered him. "By the time I notice it, it has already burned through me, and I am left only picking through the wreckage of what I have said." The teacher did not lecture him. She simply handed him an axe and led him to a woodpile near her modest home and asked him to chop a single piece of wood, slowly, paying attention to every part of the motion, the raising of the arms, the falling of the blade, the impact against the grain, the particular stillness after the wood split cleanly in two. He did this, feeling somewhat foolish, certain that such a simple exercise could not possibly address a temper that had plagued him his entire adult life. "Now," she said once he had finished, "when the anger begins in you, not once it has already consumed you entirely, but at the very first spark, the very first tightening in your chest, I want you to find one motion, one single action as simple as this axe stroke, and give your full attention to it instead of to the anger." "Will that make the anger disappear?" "No," she said plainly. "Not at first, and perhaps not ever entirely. The anger will still be there, and you may still feel its heat rising in you the way you always have. But a fire that has your full attention on it, one small deliberate motion at a time, cannot spread the way a fire spreads through a mind occupied with nothing but its own burning, feeding itself on every thought it passes." Anne practiced this for months, at first with little success. The anger would rise, and he would remember the teaching only after he had already shouted, already thrown something, already frightened his daughter again. He grew discouraged, wondering if he was simply too far gone for such a gentle remedy. But slowly, almost without his noticing the exact moment it began to change, he found himself catching the anger a little earlier each time, feeling the first flicker of irritation and, instead of feeding it with the usual stream of angry thoughts, rehearsing every grievance at once, fixing his attention on his breath, moving in and out, or the particular weight of the axe still resting against his palm from memory, or the sound of the wind moving through the trees outside his window. One honest, present motion, given his whole attention, however briefly. The anger did not vanish from his life entirely. He was not, in the end, a different man, only a man who had learned something new about the man he already was. But it stopped consuming the landscape the way it once had. It became, over time, something he could stand beside and watch pass through him, rather than something that stood behind him and pushed him forward against his will. His daughter, years later, no longer hid behind her mother's skirts when her father's voice rose slightly with the ordinary frustrations of a hard day. She had learned, as he had, that a fire noticed early rarely grows large enough to need running from. This is the second labor of right effort, to abandon what has already arisen, not by suppressing it, which only drives the fire underground to smolder and gather strength in darkness, but by redirecting one's attention fully and simply, the way a woodcutter gives his whole care to a single stroke of the axe, and lets that single stroke be enough. Years later, Anne's own daughter, now grown and raising a son of her own, found herself standing in her kitchen one evening, jaw clenched, a shattered cup on the floor before her, the echo of her own raised voice still hanging in the air where her small son had just fled the room in tears. She stood there a long moment, horrified at how closely The shape of the scene matched fragments of her own childhood she had hoped never to repeat. She went to her father that night, ashamed, expecting perhaps a lecture on the temper he himself had once carried and worked so hard to set down. Instead, he simply made tea for them both and sat with her at the table. "I did not become a different man," he told her, when she finally found the words to explain what had happened. "I want you to understand that clearly, so you do not chase an impossible standard. I still feel the fire rise in me sometimes, even now. An old man with a temper still somewhere inside him. The difference is only that I notice it sooner than I once did, and I have a single motion: my breath, the weight of an old axe handle in memory, that I return my attention to before the fire has the chance to spread through the whole house. And if I forget the motion, in the moment, the way I forgot tonight, then you clean up the cup," he said simply. "And you go to your son, and you tell him the truth, that something in you rose too quickly, and that you are working, still, at your age, as much as at his, to notice it sooner next time. That too is part of the practice, not never failing, simply returning honestly to the work each time you do." In the hill country, where the soil ran thin and rocky in places and rich and dark in others, there lived an old woman named Priya, who kept a garden that visitors often mistook for wild growth, though nothing in it was accidental, and every plant had arrived there by her own patient hand. Each year, before the rains came, when the air still carried the particular dry, waiting quality of the season's last weeks, she walked the perimeter of her land and planted seeds in places where nothing yet grew. Bare patches of soil hardened by years of foot traffic, the neglected edges of paths, spaces beneath larger trees where sunlight barely reached and most gardeners would not have bothered trying at all. Neighbors sometimes asked why she bothered planting in soil so unpromising, when there was ample fertile ground elsewhere on her land that would have rewarded her effort more reliably. "Because it is bare now," she said, without looking up from her work, "does not mean it must remain so forever. I do not know which bare place will surprise me. I have stopped pretending that I do. Many of the seeds did not take. Some places remained stubbornly empty for years, despite her tending, no matter how carefully she prepared the soil or how faithfully she returned to water it. She did not treat these failures as verdicts on the soil or on herself. She simply noted them and tried again the following season, sometimes with a different seed, sometimes with patience alone. But some, unexpectedly, flourished. A patch of wildflowers beneath a tree everyone had assumed was too shaded for anything to grow, blooming one spring in a riot of small yellow color that stopped passers-by in their tracks. A run of herbs along a path that travelers had trampled flat for a decade, which somehow found root between the footsteps and filled the air each evening with a fragrance no one had expected from ground so abused. A young relative visiting from the city and finding the old woman's patience almost incomprehensible, once asked her how she decided where wholesome things might grow in a life, rather than only in soil. "It is the same question," Priya said, setting down her trowel to give the question its due weight. "There are places within a person, habits of kindness, patience, generosity, the willingness to forgive, that have not yet been planted. Not because they are impossible for that person, The way some might assume certain souls are simply born harder or colder than others, but because no one has yet tried the seed in that particular soil, at that particular time, with that particular patience. She described watching her own granddaughter grow up with a quick and sometimes cruel wit, sharp-tongued in a way that had worried Priya for years, take her first tentative steps toward patience. Not because patience had always been present within her, waiting quietly to be uncovered like buried treasure, but because someone, at some point, some teacher or friend, or perhaps simply a difficult experience, had planted a single seed of it in soil that had seemed until then entirely and permanently bare. You do not wait for the ground to become promising before planting, Priya said, returning to her trowel. You plant, and then you discover over seasons whether the ground was more promising than it appeared. And very often it was. It simply needed someone willing to kneel down and try. This is the third labor of right effort, to cultivate what is wholesome but has not yet arisen. Kindness where there has been none. Patience where there has been none. Stillness where there has been none. Not because success is guaranteed, and it very often is not, but because the bare patch of soil will remain bare forever if no one ever plants there at all. If everyone simply assumes, looking at the shade and the hardened ground, that nothing good could ever possibly take root there. The granddaughter Priya had spoken of, now a woman grown with children of her own, returned to the hill country many years later after Priya had passed to see what remained of the old garden. She found it much changed. Some patches gone entirely to wild grass, reclaimed by whatever had been there before Priya's hands first touched the soil, but others still flourishing in ways that startled her, as though the old woman's attention had left behind a kind of permission for certain things to keep growing long after she herself was gone. She knelt for a while beside the patch of wildflowers beneath the shaded tree, the very patch everyone had once assumed was too dark for anything at all, now spread wider than she remembered it, seeding itself further each year without any hand tending it any longer. She thought of her own quick tongue as a girl, the sharp words she had once thrown so easily at her brothers, at her own mother, and of the single seed her grandmother had planted in that particular soil so many years before, with no promise that it would ever take. She thought of how long it had taken to notice any change in herself at all, and how, now, her own children rarely saw in her the temper she remembered so clearly in her younger self. She did not know, kneeling there among the wild flowers, whether she would have found patience in herself eventually regardless, without her grandmother's quiet insistence on planting where nothing yet grew. But she suspected, watching the flowers nod gently in the hillside breeze, that some kinds of ground do not turn themselves over on their own, and are grateful, whether they can say so or not, for the hands that once knelt there anyway. In a mountain temple, known for its long, difficult winters, where the wind found every gap in the old wooden walls and the cold settled into the stone floors by midday and never fully left, the monks kept a single fire burning through the coldest months. Not because fire was scarce, but because relighting it from nothing, in the deep cold, with numbed fingers and damp kindling, was far harder than simply keeping a small flame alive. A young monk named Dara was given the task one winter of tending this fire through the night, a duty he had heard whispered about with a certain dread among the other novices, none of whom relished the long, cold hours it required. He assumed at first that his job was simple: keep enough wood nearby and add a log whenever the flame grew low, the way one might feed an animal at fixed intervals and consider the matter settled. But an older monk, noticing his novice approach to the task, corrected him gently one evening as they sat together beside the modest hearth. "The fire does not fail because of too little wood," he said. "There is always wood enough, stacked high beside it. It fails because of inattention." A flame left alone for even a short while can gutter down to embers that no longer hold enough heat to catch the next log, no matter how dry or well split that log might be. Then even a full woodpile beside it will not save it, and you will find yourself at 3 a.m, trying to coax life back into ash with hands too cold to properly work the kindling. Dara took this to heart and learned, through trial and several very cold nights, to check the fire often through the long hours, not anxiously, not constantly disturbing it with unnecessary pokes and adjustments that did more harm than good, but with a steady, unhurried rhythm of attention, returning to it again and again before it had the chance to fade too far, the way a careful parent checks on a sleeping child without needing to hover. Some nights he grew tired, his eyes heavy despite his best intentions, and let too much time pass between visits, lulled by the temple's stillness into a doze he had not meant to fall into. On those nights, he woke with a start to a fire barely clinging to life, a few faint orange embers in a bed of grey ash, and had to work hard, blowing gently, feeding it thin slivers of dry wood, coaxing it with patient breath, to bring it back to a proper warmth before the cold could seep too deeply into the temple's sleeping occupants. Other nights, when his attention was steady, when he returned to the hearth at regular intervals without fail, the fire simply continued as it had been left, needing only small, easy additions of wood to remain exactly what it already was, requiring no dramatic rescue, no anxious labor, only the quiet continuity of someone who had not let it be forgotten. "It would be easier," he said to the older monk one morning, exhausted from a night of near failures, "if the fire, once well lit, could simply take care of itself and free me to sleep as the others do." "That is true of very few good things," the older monk replied, pouring them both tea to warm their hands before the coming day's duties. "A kindness, once practiced, does not remain in you forever without tending, the way you might assume after a single generous act that generosity has now simply become part of your character, settled and secure. A patience hard won in one season can quietly gutter out in the next, if you assume it no longer needs your attention, if you grow complacent believing the work is finished. The good that has already arisen in you is not a monument, carved once and left standing regardless of the weather. It is a fire. It wants only a small, steady return, again and again, before it fades too far to easily recover. And it is far easier to keep such a fire alive than to relight it from cold ash in the dead of winter. This is the fourth labor of right effort, to maintain what is wholesome and has already arisen, not through anxious vigilance, which exhausts the one maintaining it, and not through the comfortable assumption that goodness, once achieved, sustains itself without further attention, but through the same quiet, unremarkable returning, that keeps any small fire alive through a long winter night, log by log, visit by visit, without fanfare and without rest. Dara himself became, in time, the older monk who taught this same lesson to the next generation of novices assigned the winter fire. He remembered teaching them how tempting it had once been to believe that a fire burning brightly one evening required nothing further of him. How easily that belief had led more than once to the shock of waking to cold ash. He noticed the same belief taking root in a young novice one particularly harsh winter, a boy who kept the fire beautifully through the early nights of his assignment, growing visibly proud of the warmth he maintained. And then, as the weeks wore on and no failure came to correct him, began to check it less often, certain by then that he had simply mastered the task. Dara did not scold him when the inevitable happened, when the boy woke one morning to find the fire nearly gone and the temple uncomfortably cold. He simply helped him coax it back to life, and afterward, over tea, told him gently, "The fire does not care how well you kept it last week. It only knows tonight. And whether you return to it tonight the way you did when you first began, before your own confidence had a chance to make you careless." The boy took this to heart in a way he might not have, Dara suspected, if he had simply been warned of the danger beforehand rather than allowed to discover it himself in the particular cold of an unattended hearth. Some lessons, Dara had come to believe, needed to be lived through once before a teaching could truly settle. And this, too, he thought, might be its own quiet kind of right effort, knowing when to let a lesson arrive in its own time, rather than forcing it early through warning alone. At a monastery known throughout the region for its rigorous training, where the bells rang before dawn and the schedule left little room for idle hours, there lived a monk named Noble, whose devotion was so total that other monks whispered about him with a mixture of awe and worry, unsure whether to admire him or fear for him. He slept perhaps 3 hours a night, rising long before the morning bell to begin his private practice while others still dreamed. He ate the smallest permitted portion of food at each meal, even when more was offered by well-meaning attendants, believing that any comfort taken, any excess beyond bare necessity, was a comfort stolen from his awakening, a debt he would somehow have to repay later on the path. He recited scripture until his voice grew hoarse and cracked, pushing through the discomfort as further proof of his sincerity, and meditated through the hours when others rested, sitting rigid and unmoving on the cold floor, long after the others had retired, believing that discomfort itself was a kind of currency, exchangeable eventually for enlightenment if only enough of it were accumulated. For a time, the younger monks admired him openly, held him up as an example of what true dedication looked like, whispered his name with a kind of reverence usually reserved for teachers many decades his senior. Here, they thought, watching him pass by hollow-eyed and unwavering, was a man who would surely awaken before any of them. But over the seasons, something in Noel began to fray, visibly, in ways even his admirers could no longer overlook. His hands trembled during the simplest tasks, pouring tea, holding a brush to copy scripture, tasks that had once been effortless to him. His temper, once mild and even, grew sharp with those around him, a sharpness he seemed unaware of himself, as though exhaustion had worn away his ability to notice his own harshness, even as others flinched from it. He fainted once during a long ceremony, collapsing suddenly in the middle of a chant, and had to be carried to his quarters by two alarmed junior monks who had never imagined their model of devotion could fall so completely. The abbot visited him there some days later, once Noel had regained enough strength to sit upright, and sat with him quietly for some time before speaking, letting the silence settle between them the way silence settles over a room after a long illness. "You run," the abbot finally said, his voice gentle, carrying none of the disappointment Noel had braced himself for, as though awakening were a village at the far end of a very long road, and the only way to arrive is to run faster than every other traveler on that same road, faster even than your own body can sustain. "Is that not the aim?" Noel asked, his voice thin, still weak from the fainting spell. "To arrive as quickly as possible, before this life ends and the chance is lost." "A runner who collapses a mile before the village does not arrive faster for having run so hard," the abbot said, without unkindness. "He simply lies down in the road, further from the village, in truth, than the traveller who paced himself and is still walking steadily toward it even now, while you lie here recovering your strength." Noel was quiet, ashamed at first, his eyes fixed on his own trembling hands, though the abbot's tone held no judgment in it, only the plain observation of someone who had watched many runners collapse before him over many years of teaching, and had learned not to scold them for it, only to help them rise again more wisely. "Effort is not measured by suffering," the abbot said. "A man does not draw closer to peace by manufacturing more of its opposite along the way, believing that the size of his suffering is somehow proof of the size of his sincerity. Rest, when rest is what the body and mind require, is not a betrayal of the path, however much it may feel that way to a mind convinced that ease is always a kind of theft. It is simply a wiser pace, chosen by someone who intends to actually arrive, rather than someone who intends only to be seen running." Noel began, slowly and with some initial resistance, to eat what was offered rather than the smallest portion he could justify, to sleep when sleep was due, rather than fighting it as an enemy. He did not abandon his devotion. The fire of his sincerity had not been the problem, only its uncontrolled burning. But he stopped mistaking exhaustion for progress, and in the seasons that followed, walked further and more steadily, and with far less trembling in his hands than he ever had while running. Some years later, a visiting teacher from another monastery, hearing the story of Noel's collapse and slow recovery, asked him directly whether he ever resented the months he had spent, as he now saw it, on the wrong path entirely, running himself into the ground for what turned out to be a mistaken understanding of devotion. Noel considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not think of it as wasted," he said. "I needed to run that hard in truth, to learn what running that hard actually costs, and what it does not buy. If the abbot had simply told me on my very first day to eat more and sleep more, I do not believe I would have believed him. I had to nearly break first, the way one sometimes has to hear a string snap before truly understanding what too much tension means, rather than simply being told. So the collapse itself was part of the path, Not a part I would recommend seeking out, Noel said, with the faint trace of dry humor he had developed only after his recovery, a lightness that had been entirely absent from him during his years of grim striving. But yes, I have come to see it as part of my own particular path, however much I might wish, looking back, that I had found the truer tuning sooner and with less collapsing along the way. Not far from where Bhante Noel trained, in a monastery known for its gentler pace, there lived another monk, Sofiak, whose story unfolded in the opposite direction, though it took just as long in its own quiet way to reveal its true shape. Sofiak was gentle by nature, well liked by everyone who met him, quick to offer a kind word or a helping hand, and this gentleness had, over time, become an excuse, so gradually that he himself never noticed the exact moment it happened. When meditation grew difficult, when his mind refused to settle, and the discomfort of sitting still became genuinely uncomfortable, he told himself that forcing stillness was not the Buddhist way, that true peace could never come from struggle, and so he rested instead, not occasionally, as wisdom might suggest in moments of genuine need, but as his default response to any discomfort at all, any friction whatsoever along the path. When a teaching challenged him, a passage of scripture he found difficult to accept, a practice that asked more discipline of him than he felt inclined to give, he set it aside, telling himself he would return to it when he felt more inspired, more naturally drawn to it, more ready. That day of readiness rarely came, and when it did not, he simply told himself gently that perhaps it had not been the right teaching for him after all. Years passed this way, pleasantly enough on the surface. Sofiak remained kind, well-liked, untroubled by the visible strain that marked some of his more disciplined brothers, and entirely unchanged underneath in any way that mattered. The other monks, who had once been his equals in training, who had sat beside him as novices on the very same cold floor, grew steadily in their practice around him, their understanding deepening, their presence in the community shifting subtly toward wisdom and steadiness, while he remained precisely where he had started, mistaking his comfort for peace, mistaking the absence of visible struggle for the presence of genuine stillness. An old teacher visiting the monastery from a distant province noticed this over the course of several days and asked to walk with him one quiet afternoon, the two of them moving slowly along a path that wound past the monastery's modest fields. "You seem at ease," the teacher observed, watching him closely. "I try not to force anything," Sofiak said somewhat proudly, mistaking the teacher's observation for admiration. "I have learned not to strain, unlike some of my brothers, who seem to punish themselves needlessly." The teacher nodded, neither agreeing nor disagreeing outright, and then gestured to a nearby field where a farmer worked with visible effort under the harsh midday sun, sweat darkening his shirt, his movements steady, but clearly costly. "Do you think that farmer strains?" "He seems to, yes. It looks like difficult work." And yet, by autumn, his field will feed his family through the coming winter, and theirs will be a table with rice upon it, even in the leanest months. What will your ease have given you by autumn that you did not already have this spring? Sofiak had no answer. He turned the question over in his mind, searching for something to say, and found to his quiet dismay that nothing came. "There is a difference," the teacher said gently without cruelty, "between not straining and not trying. You have confused the absence of struggle with the presence of peace, the way a field left entirely fallow might appear, to an untrained eye, indistinguishable from a field that has already yielded its harvest and now rests, earned after long labor. But peace that has never met any resistance is not peace. It is simply inertia, dressed in pieces borrowed clothing, hoping no one will look closely enough to notice the difference." Sophique sat with this for a long while after the teacher left, turning the words over as one might turn over a stone to see what lay beneath it. He began tentatively at first, and then with growing resolve to return to the difficult teachings he had long ago set aside, to sit through the discomfort of meditation rather than excusing himself from it at the very first sign of difficulty, telling himself it was not the Buddhist way to strain. It was not comfortable. His mind rebelled at first, accustomed as it was to the easier path he had walked for years. But for the first time in a long while, something in him began, quietly and without fanfare, to move, not toward a new kind of strain, but toward the genuine effort he had, for so long, mistaken ease for. He found in the months that followed that his old gentleness did not need to disappear to make room for this new effort. In fact, it served him well, keeping him from swinging too far in the other direction, toward the same punishing strain that had nearly broken Bantinol at the neighboring monastery, whose story Sophique had heard and turned over carefully in his own mind, wary of trading one imbalance for its opposite. "I do not want to become a man who cannot rest either," he confided to the visiting teacher on the older woman's final morning before she continued her travels. "I have seen what that costs in others." "Then you have already learned the harder half of the lesson," she told him, gathering her few belongings for the road ahead. "Most who discover they have been avoiding effort swing hard toward punishing themselves once they realize it, believing the correction for too little must always be a great deal more. You seem to understand already that the string wants tuning, not simply retightening past where it was too loose in the opposite direction." Sophique walked with her as far as the monastery gate and stood there a while after she had gone, watching the road she had taken disappear around the bend of a hill. He thought of the farmer in the field, sweating honestly under the sun, and of his own years of comfortable ease mistaken for peace, and felt, for the first time in a long while, something like the beginning of a true and steady effort settling into him. Not loud, not dramatic, simply present, the way a good tool feels finally right in a familiar hand. A young archer named Ket once trained under a master known throughout the region for producing students of unusual skill, students whose arrows found their marks with a consistency that seemed to outsiders almost supernatural. Ket was talented but impatient, eager to skip ahead to the mastery he saw in his teacher's older students, unwilling to accept that such mastery might require a slower road than his own ambition preferred. In his early lessons, he drew his bow with all his strength, certain that greater force meant greater accuracy, that the harder he pulled, the truer his arrow must surely fly. His arrows flew wildly in every direction but the one he intended, some far past the target entirely, vanishing into the brush beyond, some driven into the ground a few paces from his own feet, the string having released before his aim had properly settled. "You are fighting the bow," the master told him one afternoon, watching another wild shot bury itself uselessly in the dirt, as though it were an opponent to be defeated through sheer force rather than a tool to be understood and worked with the way a river is worked with by a skilled boatman rather than fought against by one who insists on rowing straight into the current. Ket did not know how to draw with anything less than his full strength. It was the only way he knew to try, the only measure of effort he had ever been taught to trust. To draw gently felt, to him, indistinguishable from not trying at all. The master had him set the bow down entirely for a week, much to Ket's visible frustration, and instead simply watch. Watch birds in flight overhead, their wings finding exactly the effort each moment of flight required. Watch water moving around a stone in the nearby stream, yielding and returning without ever once straining against the rock. Watch the master's own senior students as they drew and released, their movements almost disappointingly unremarkable to an eye trained to look for drama. "Notice," the master said, standing beside him at the stream's edge, "how little unnecessary force is present in anything that moves well. The water does not fight the stone. The bird does not thrash against the air. They simply meet what is required, and no more." When Ket returned to the bow at last, chastened and more attentive than before, the master had him draw slowly, agonizingly slowly by Ket's own impatient standards, paying attention to the precise moment where the string's tension matched the arrow's need. No more pulled than the shot required, no less than would carry it true to its mark. It took Ket a long time to find this measure, weeks that felt to him like wasted effort, though the master assured him otherwise. His body wanted to default to strain, the way a man who has always shouted to be heard struggles to learn that a quiet voice, well placed and rightly timed, carries further than any shout ever could, and does not leave the throat raw afterward. Eventually, almost without his noticing the shift, something changed. His arrows began to fly straighter, not because he had found a way to add more force to his draw, as he had once believed was the only path to improvement, but because he had finally learned to use exactly enough and no more, trusting the bow itself to do the rest of the work it was designed to do. "This is the whole of practice," the master told him once his form had settled into something steady and true. Not the discovery of some hidden strength you lacked before, some reservoir of power you simply needed to unlock through greater effort. Simply the discovery of how much force a thing actually requires, and the humility to stop adding more once that measure has been met, resisting the temptation to believe that more must always be better. Right effort, the old teachings say, is like this draw. Neither the frantic overpull of a man convinced that force alone determines the outcome of any endeavor, nor the slack string of one who has given up trying altogether out of fear or laziness, but the quiet, attentive tension of someone who has learned, through long and often frustrating practice, exactly how much a moment asks of them, and has made peace with giving exactly that, and nothing more. Years later, Ket found himself teaching his own students, and noticed among them the very same impatience he had once carried so stubbornly himself. the same conviction that force must surely be the answer to any difficulty, the same frustration when gentler instruction seemed, to their eager minds, indistinguishable from not trying hard enough. One student in particular, a strong-willed young woman named Sella, reminded him so precisely of his own younger self that he found himself smiling more than once at her frustration, though he was careful never to let her see him smile at what felt, to her, like genuine anguish. "You are fighting the bow," he told her one afternoon, watching her arrow bury itself, as his once had, uselessly in the dirt only a few paces from her own feet. "I know," she said more sharply than she likely intended. "You have told me. I do not know how to stop." "Neither did I, for a long while," Ket admitted, setting down his own bow and sitting beside her on the grass. "My teacher set my bow aside for a week and had me simply watch birds and water and other students shooting until something in me finally understood, without being told directly, how little force those things actually required to move well." Sella looked skeptical, exactly as skeptical Ket recalled, as he himself had once looked at such an instruction. But she set her own bow down that afternoon at his suggestion and walked with him to the stream nearby and watched the water move around its stones in silence for a long while, saying nothing, though something in her shoulders, Ket noticed, had already begun, faintly, to loosen. Between two villages divided by a wide, slow-moving river that swelled dangerously each monsoon season and left them isolated from one another for months at a time, there had long been talk of building a bridge, but the talk had never once become action. The task seemed too large for either village alone, and each waited, quietly, for the other to make the first move, or for some wealthier patron to arrive and simply solve the problem for them. One season, a new headman in the smaller village decided to simply begin, tired of waiting for a solution that never seemed to arrive on its own. He did not wait for the larger village's full commitment, which he suspected might never fully materialize, nor did he attempt the entire bridge himself in a single burst of ambition, which he knew from experience would only exhaust him and his small band of helpers within weeks. He gathered a handful of willing hands from his own village and began setting the first stone pilings at the river's edge, a small, achievable piece of a very large task, small enough that no one felt overwhelmed by its scope. Word of this modest beginning reached the larger village within days, carried by travelers who had seen the first stones being set. Some there mocked the effort as too small to matter, laughing that a handful of men with simple tools could never hope to span such a wide river. But a few, moved by the sight of genuine, sustained work rather than mere talk that had circulated for years without producing so much as a single stone, crossed the river to help, drawn by something in the quiet persistence of the labor itself. The bridge did not rise quickly, and there were long stretches where its progress would have been invisible to anyone glancing at it only occasionally. Some seasons, only a single piling was set, the work slowed by rains or illness, or the simple demands of the harvest that pulled hands away to more urgent tasks. Other seasons, heavy rains destroyed a section that had taken months to build, washing away stones that had seemed, only days before, permanently set. And the workers had to begin that portion again from nothing, swallowing their discouragement as best they could. There were long stretches where progress seemed to stop entirely, and the villagers on both sides grew doubtful, some openly questioning whether the bridge would ever actually be completed within their lifetimes, whether the whole endeavor had simply become another kind of talk, dressed up as action but no more likely in the end to produce anything real. But the headman held to a simple rhythm through all of it. Some effort, regularly given, rather than either grand bursts of activity followed by long stretches of abandonment when enthusiasm inevitably waned, or no effort at all disguised as patient waiting for a better season. Years later, more years than anyone had originally imagined the work would require, the bridge stood complete at last, its stone pilings weathered now to the same grey as the river rocks around them, and both villages used it daily, most having long forgotten how uncertain its beginning had been. How many had doubted it would ever stand at all? An old woman who had helped set the very first stone, her hands now bent with age, was once asked by a curious grandchild how she had endured the years of slow, uncertain work without giving up entirely. "I did not think of the bridge as a whole," she said, settling into her memory of it. "If I had thought of the whole bridge, the whole wide river, the whole enormous task before us, I believe I would have simply sat down on the bank and never lifted a single stone. I thought only of the next stone, the one directly in front of me. Some days that stone was easy to set, and the work went quickly, and I felt almost joyful in it. Some days it seemed impossible, my back aching, the river running high and cold, and I did almost nothing at all that day, only enough to say I had returned. But I returned to the riverbank again the next day regardless, and set what stone I could, and did not judge myself too harshly for the days when that stone was small. This is right effort, practiced across years rather than moments, not the single heroic feat that ends a struggle in one dramatic stroke, and not the comfortable absence of any commitment disguised as patience, but the humble, repeated return to whatever small stone the day allows, however modest, however unglamorous, trusting that the bridge will rise in its own time from nothing more than this. The bridge, in the generations since its completion, had needed its own occasional repair, a piling loosened by an unusually violent flood season, a plank worn through by decades of passing feet and cartwheels. Each time, the villages on both sides found themselves falling back into the same old rhythm the original builders had established. No grand rebuilding all at once, no urgent campaign to restore it overnight, but simply a small crew returning stone by stone or plank by plank, until the repair too was quietly finished. A young engineer visiting from the provincial capital to survey the bridge's condition many years after its first builders had passed on, found this approach almost quaint by the standards of the busier world she came from, where such repairs were typically contracted out to be completed within a fixed and pressured timeline. "Would it not be faster," she asked one of the village elders, "to simply hire enough hands to finish this repair within the week, rather than letting it stretch across a season, as your people seem inclined to do?" "Perhaps," the elder admitted, "but we have found across generations now that a bridge built or repaired in a great hurry by hands unfamiliar with its particular stones tends to fail again sooner than one tended slowly by those who know it well, who have walked across it every day of their lives and understand, without needing to consult any survey, exactly where its weaknesses lie. We are in no great hurry here. The bridge has stood a long time already, built by people who were in no great hurry either. A mother named Sremam had a son who, in his 16th year, grew distant from her almost overnight, or so it seemed to her. Sharp in his words where he had once been soft, closed in his silences where he had once chattered freely about his day, absent even when present in the room, his eyes fixed on some middle distance she could no longer follow him into. At first, Sremam responded the way many parents do when faced with such a sudden, bewildering distance, with increased pressure, believing that more effort, more insistence, more direct confrontation of the problem would surely close the gap that had opened between them. More questions at the dinner table, each one met with a shrug or a monosyllable. More insistence that he explain himself, share his thoughts, return to the openness he had once offered so freely. More attempts to force the closeness they had once shared back into being through sheer will, as though love could be summoned by demand alone. This only pushed him further away. Each attempt at connection met with a harder wall than the one before. Each question answered with a shorter, colder reply, until dinners passed in near total silence, and Sremam found herself lying awake at night, replaying every conversation for some clue as to where she had gone wrong. Exhausted and frightened by the widening distance, and increasingly convinced she was watching her son slip away from here entirely, she visited an elder in her community, a woman known for raising 5 children who all eventually returned to close relationships with her in adulthood, despite years of similar distance during their own adolescence. "I have tried everything," Sremam said, her voice cracking slightly. "I have tried harder than I have ever tried at anything in my entire life. And still, he pulls further away with each attempt." "Perhaps," the elder said gently, pouring tea for them both, "you have tried in only one direction, toward him, and only toward him, again and again, with increasing force each time the previous attempt failed. Effort is not only measured by how hard you push, it is also measured by whether you are pushing in the direction that the moment actually calls for, or whether you are simply pushing harder in a direction that has already shown you repeatedly that it does not work." She suggested that Sremam's effort, for now, might best be directed not at closing the distance by force, which had only ever widened it further, but at simply remaining steadily, unwaveringly present, available without demand, warm without pressure, offering her presence the way a lamp offers light, without insisting that anyone come and read by it, so that when her son was ready to close the distance himself, in his own time and by his own choosing, there would be no wall on her side left to climb, no accumulated resentment or hurt for him to navigate around. This was, in its own way, far harder than pushing had been, harder in a way that surprised Sremam, who had assumed that simply doing less would be the easier path. It required her to sit with an ache she could not immediately resolve, to offer warmth into silence that was not returned, again and again, without giving up on him and without forcing the issue further, a discipline of restraint that tested her far more than the previous months of direct confrontation ever had. It took over a year in which there were many evenings Sremam doubted the elder's advice entirely. Many nights She nearly returned to her old pattern of pressing questions and demanded explanations. But slowly, in small unprompted moments, a question asked without being pushed, a choice to sit in the same room as her while doing his homework rather than retreating to his own quarters, a brief, unguarded laugh at something she said that surprised them both. Her son began, on his own terms and in his own season, to close some of the distance he had once needed to open. Right effort, the elder told her afterward, once the worst of the distance had passed, is not always more force applied in the same direction you have always applied it, however sincere that force may be. Sometimes it is the harder work of remaining steady, patient, and present while someone else finds their own way back across the distance in their own time. Trusting that your steadiness, rather than your pressure, is what will ultimately draw them home. Years later, when Sremom's son had grown into a father himself, he came to her one evening, troubled, describing a similar distance beginning to open between himself and his own eldest daughter, now navigating the same difficult passage he once had. He asked his mother, half hoping she might simply tell him what to say to close the gap quickly, the way he had once hoped a single right question might close the gap with her. Sremom only smiled, recognizing in his urgency an echo of her own younger fear. "I cannot tell you what to say," she told him. "I am not certain there is any single thing to say at all. What I can tell you is what I wish someone had told me sooner. That the ache of waiting without pushing is a real ache, and you should not pretend otherwise to yourself, and that the ache does not mean you are failing her. It may simply mean you are finally offering her the room she needs to find her own way back, in her own season, the same room I eventually learned to offer you." Her son sat with this for a long while, and though it gave him no immediate solution to carry home that evening, something in the weight he had brought with him seemed, by the time he rose to leave, to have grown a little more bearable. Not lighter exactly, but shared. The way any old and well-understood ache becomes easier to carry once someone who has carried it before sits beside you and simply confirms that yes, this is what it feels like, and yes, it does eventually ease. When her husband died, suddenly and without warning, after 30 years of marriage, a woman named Chenda was told by well-meaning neighbors, one after another in the difficult days that followed, that she must be strong, must return quickly to her usual tasks, must not let grief take hold of her for too long, lest it consume her entirely and leave her unable to function at all. She tried at first to obey this advice, believing it came from genuine wisdom and care, rather than simply the discomfort of those around her who did not know how else to help. She rose each morning and forced herself through her chores with a brittle, joyless determination, refusing to let herself weep even in the privacy of her own kitchen, believing this refusal itself to be a kind of discipline, a kind of effort toward healing that would surely eventually produce the peace everyone assured her was waiting on the other side of enough willpower. But the grief did not disperse for being ignored, did not simply fade away as she had hoped it might once she had proven herself strong enough to deny it entrance. It gathered instead, pressing harder against the wall she had built each day to hold it back, gathering weight and pressure with every tear she refused to shed, until one evening, nearly 2 months after the funeral, on an evening no different from any other. It broke through entirely, and she found herself unable to rise from her bed at all the following morning, undone not by grief itself, which she might have survived, but by the exhausting effort of denying it for so long, an effort that had finally cost her more than the grief itself ever would have. An old monk who had known her husband for many years, who had shared tea with him countless times in the years before his death, came to visit during this difficult stretch and sat with her without offering the usual advice to be strong, without adding his own voice to the chorus that had already, she felt, failed her so completely. "Grief," he said, settling onto the low stool beside her bed, his voice carrying none of the brisk encouragement she had grown to dread from others, "is not an obstacle on the path that must be overcome through force, the way one might force through a difficult meditation posture by simply enduring the discomfort until it passes. It is more like weather, vast and beyond your control in its timing. You do not defeat a storm through effort, however much effort you might muster against it. You simply find the right shelter and wait with patience for it to pass through you in its own time, trusting that it will eventually, though perhaps not on the schedule others might prefer for you. Then what should my effort be?" she asked, her voice raw from weeks of unshed tears, now finally, quietly, beginning to fall. "Everyone tells me to be strong, and I have tried, and it has only made things worse." "Not the effort of resistance," he said gently. "The effort of tending, which is a very different kind of labor, quieter and far less visible to those who expect grief to look a certain way in order to be taken seriously. Eat, even a little, when you can, even if it is only a few spoonfuls of rice. Rest, even briefly, when you can, without demanding of yourself that the rest produce some visible improvement by morning. Let those who care for you sit nearby, even in silence, without requiring yourself to make conversation or reassure them that you are managing well. This is effort too, quieter and harder to see than the effort of forcing yourself upright before you are ready, harder even to recognize as effort at all by those accustomed to measuring effort only by its visible strain. But it is effort all the same, and it is the effort this particular season of your life actually requires of you, whatever the neighbors may believe. Chenda began, slowly and with many setbacks, to allow the grief its weather, tending to herself gently through its passing, rather than fighting to stand upright before the storm had finished its course. In time, not quickly, and not through force, and not on any schedule she or her neighbors might have preferred. She did rise. But she rose because the storm had genuinely passed, tended through, rather than merely denied. Not because she had willed herself to stand before she was truly ready to bear her own weight again. Some years afterward, a younger woman in the village, recently widowed herself and receiving the very same well-meaning advice to simply be strong that Chenda had once received, came to sit with her, having heard that Chenda understood this particular weather better than most. Chenda did not offer her a great deal of advice. She mostly listened and made tea, and occasionally, when the younger woman's silence stretched long enough to need something gentle placed into it, offered a small observation rather than an instruction. that some mornings would be simply for surviving until evening, and that this was not failure, that eating a few spoonfuls of rice on a day when nothing else seemed possible was, in fact, a kind of quiet victory rather than the small and unremarkable thing it might feel like. "Does it end?" the younger woman finally asked, her voice small. "The neighbors keep telling me it will end soon, if I am strong enough." "It changes," Chenda said carefully, unwilling to offer false comfort, but equally unwilling to leave the woman without any comfort at all. "I do not know that grief for someone you loved so deeply ever fully ends in the way people sometimes promise. But the storm part of it, the part that keeps you from rising at all, that part does pass in its own time once you stop fighting it and simply let it move through you as it needs to. I promise you that much, because I have lived it myself, storm to stillness, and I would not tell you so if I were not certain." On a hillside prone to strong seasonal winds that swept down from the mountains each year with predictable violence, there grew two kinds of trees. A stand of tall, rigid hardwoods that had stood for generations, their trunks thick as a man's embrace, and beside them, a grove of bamboo, tall and slender, its stalks bending even in ordinary breezes that the hardwoods barely seemed to notice. During the calm seasons, which made up most of the year, the hardwoods appeared far more impressive to any observer, thick-trunked, imposing, casting deep, cooling shade across the hillside that travelers gratefully rested beneath during the hot months. The bamboo, by comparison, seemed almost frail, bending and swaying at the slightest disturbance, its constant motion sometimes mistaken by visitors for a kind of nervous instability rather than the flexible strength it actually possessed. But when the great storms came, as they did every few years with a violence that stripped leaves from every tree on the hillside and sent lesser branches flying, something reversed entirely. The rigid hardwoods, unable to yield to the wind's growing force, cracked instead. Their thick trunks splitting under pressure, they had no way to absorb or redirect, having spent their entire existence relying solely on their own solidity to see them through. Several fell entirely during the worst of these storms, uprooted or snapped clean through at heights that left jagged, splintered stumps standing where proud trees had stood only hours before. The bamboo, meanwhile, bent nearly to the ground under the very same wind, bowing so low during the fiercest gusts that a passing traveler, had anyone been foolish enough to be traveling during such a storm, might have assumed it too would surely break under such extreme pressure, might have looked away rather than watch what seemed like an inevitable destruction. It did not break. When the storm passed, when the wind finally exhausted itself and the hillside fell quiet again beneath a washed and clearing sky, the bamboo simply straightened again, stalk by stalk, apparently unharmed by an ordeal that had toppled trees many times its girth, having yielded exactly as much as the moment required and no more before returning to its original shape once the pressure had passed. A young forester tasked with clearing storm debris each year from the hillside paths, a task that grew heavier each season as more hardwoods fell, noticed this pattern over several years of such storms and asked an elder in his village why the seemingly stronger trees so often failed, while the seemingly weaker ones endured, storm after storm, without exception. Strength and rigidity are not the same thing. however much they may resemble one another to an untrained eye," the elder said, watching the young forester stack broken hardwood limbs for firewood. The hardwood believes that to remain itself, to remain a proper and dignified tree, it must never bend, must meet every force with equal and opposite resistance. So when a force greater than its resistance finally arrives, as it eventually always does, it has no way to meet that force except to break entirely, having no other strategy available to it after a lifetime of relying solely on rigidity. And the bamboo has made no such promise to itself. "None," the elder said. "It bends as far as each moment requires, trusting that its roots, spread wide and deep beneath the soil, though invisible from above, not its rigidity, are what hold it in place through any storm. It does not measure its own worth by how little it moves in the wind. It measures its worth, if it measures anything at all, by whether it is still standing once the wind has finally passed. This is often mistaken in matters of effort for weakness, the willingness to bend, to yield, to rest when a moment calls for rest, rather than forcing oneself to remain rigidly unmoved regardless of the mounting pressure, however much such rigidity might be admired from a distance during the calm seasons. But the old teachings suggest otherwise, that the appropriate effort is not the one that never bends, proud and unyielding, until the moment it finally shatters, but the one that bends exactly as far as wisdom requires, trusting its roots to bring it upright again once the storm has passed, and asking for no more credit than that. The young forester, some years later, found himself in a position of some authority within his own family, tasked with caring for an aging father who had always prided himself, much like the hardwoods on the hillside, on never bending to anyone's needs but his own. When illness finally forced the old man into a dependence he had spent his whole life avoiding, he resisted every offer of help with a stubbornness that seemed, to the forester, painfully familiar. "He will not bend," the forester confided to the same elder who had once explained the bamboo to him. "He would rather struggle alone and risk falling than accept an arm to lean on. I fear he will break entirely rather than simply lean, the way those old hardwoods finally split rather than sway." "Then, perhaps," the elder said gently, "you might show him the bamboo rather than argue with him about it. Sometimes a person cannot hear a teaching directed at them, but can still recognize themselves quite clearly in a story told about someone else, or something else entirely." The forester did exactly this, walked with his father one calm afternoon to the very hillside where the bamboo and hardwood still stood, and simply described what he had once learned there without pressing the comparison too directly. His father said little in response, characteristically, but the forester noticed in the weeks that followed a very slight softening in the old man's resistance, an acceptance, offered without any admission that acceptance had been given at all, of an arm now and then on the harder days to lean on. Among the old Chan teaching stories, passed down through generations of masters and students, there is a well-known sequence of images depicting a herdsman in search of an ox, the ox representing the untrained mind, wandering wherever its habits and cravings lead it, often far from where its owner would wish it to remain. In the early images of this sequence, the herdsman searches everywhere across a vast and unfamiliar landscape, exhausted by the search, finding only footprints here and there, hints that the ox has passed this way, but is not yet found, evidence of its presence without the presence itself, a frustration many students recognize immediately from their own early attempts at meditation, when even the mind's location seems impossible to pin down. In the middle images, he finally catches sight of the ox at last, wild and resistant, its horns lowered, straining hard against the rope the moment he manages to loop it around its neck, pulling toward every distraction along the path. A patch of sweet grass here, a startling noise there. Anything that might justify bolting from the herdsman's grip entirely. A student once asked a teacher during a long afternoon of study why the images did not simply skip ahead to the calmer, later stages, why the ox must first be found wild and unruly, straining against the rope with such visible resistance, before finally growing calm enough to walk peacefully beside its herder. Because that is the honest order of things, the teacher said, setting down the scroll they had been examining together. No mind arrives at stillness by first being still, however much we might wish for such a shortcut. It arrives at stillness by first being found, wild as it is, exactly as wild as it actually is, rather than as we might prefer it to be, and then held, not crushed through force, which only frightens the ox into further wildness, and not released entirely at the first sign of resistance, which teaches it that straining always wins, but held with a steady hand, exactly firm enough that the ox cannot bolt entirely, and exactly gentle enough that it does not simply fight the rope forever out of pure panic. In the later images of the sequence, images the student had always found more peaceful to look upon than the earlier, more strenuous scenes, the ox walks calmly beside the herdsman without any rope at all, having learned over time that no rope is needed, that the herdsman's presence alone is sufficient guidance. And eventually, in the final images of the whole sequence, the herdsman and the ox are both simply absent from the scene altogether. Only an empty circle remains in some versions, or a landscape returning to its own ordinary, untroubled beauty in others. A river running past, a mountain unremarkable and simply present, untroubled by any searching at all. And notice, the teacher said, tapping the final image gently with one finger, that even in the calmest final images, the effort of the earlier search is not erased, is not undone or made to look as though it never happened. It is simply no longer visible, the way a farmer's early effort in clearing a field is no longer visible once the field has become simply a field. Its history of labor invisible beneath its present settled order. The absence of visible effort in the later stages does not mean no effort was required to arrive there. It means the effort has finally been given its proper shape and worn smooth by long practice until it no longer looks like effort at all, until it looks, instead, like peace, indistinguishable to an outside observer from a peace that had never required any struggle in the first place, though the herdsman himself would know better. The student who had asked the original question returned to the same teacher many years later, having spent the intervening decades in his own long practice, his own long search for an ox that had, at times, felt permanently lost to him. He brought with him, on this visit, a question that had only occurred to him after so much time had passed. In the final images, he said, when the herdsman and the ox are both gone, and only the empty landscape remains, Does the herdsman disappear because he finally succeeded completely? Or does he disappear because he finally stopped needing to be seen succeeding at all? The old teacher, herself much older now than on their first meeting, considered the question with evident pleasure, as though it were exactly the question she had hoped he would eventually think to ask. "I have wondered the same thing for most of my own life," she admitted. "I no longer think there is a single answer that captures it fully. Perhaps it is both at once, that a mind sufficiently well-tuned no longer needs the story of its own taming told back to it, no longer needs to stand at the center of the picture admiring how far it has come. It simply becomes part of the ordinary landscape again, the way the ox itself, once wild, eventually became simply another quiet shape, grazing beside the water, needing no rope, no herdsman, no story at all." The student sat with this for a long while, watching the same landscape the teacher had gestured toward. A river, unremarkable and calm, moving past them both without any evident effort at all, though he now understood better than he once had everything such calm had required to arrive. A potter named Vishay was known throughout his village and several neighboring ones for bowls of unusual grace, thin-walled, perfectly balanced in the hand, each one seeming almost to have shaped itself without effort, as though the clay had simply chosen on its own to take such a beautiful form. A young apprentice, eager to learn his method after admiring his work for years in the village market, expected to be taught some special technique upon arriving at Vishay's modest workshop, some secret motion of the hands, some closely guarded trick passed down through generations that produced such consistently graceful results. Instead, Vishay set him to the wheel on his very first day and told him simply to make bowls, as many as he could manage, one after another, with no expectation whatsoever that any of them would be good, an instruction that struck the young apprentice as almost insultingly simple for a craft he had assumed held deeper mysteries. The apprentice's first bowls were, indeed, quite poor, lopsided in ways that seemed to defy the very physics of the wheel, too thick in some places and dangerously thin in others, collapsing at the rim just as they seemed nearly finished, sagging suddenly into shapeless lumps that had to be scraped off the wheel and returned to the clay pile. He grew frustrated within the first week, certain he was missing some crucial instruction Vishay had failed to give him, some detail withheld either through oversight or worse, through some test of his worthiness he had not yet passed. "You are trying to make a perfect bowl," Vishay observed one afternoon, watching him struggle for perhaps the 40th time with a wall that refused to rise evenly. "That is your error, and it is the same error nearly every apprentice makes in their first weeks. Stop trying to make a perfect bowl. Simply make the next bowl, paying full attention to it as it exists right now beneath your hands, and then set it aside. Good or bad, it does not matter, and make another." The apprentice found this strange advice counter to everything he assumed about mastering a craft, but he had no better plan of his own, so he followed it as instructed. Bowl after bowl, day after day, week after week, most of them still flawed in one way or another, some more than others. None of them held up afterward as failures to dwell upon and berate himself over. None of them celebrated as triumphs to try to exactly repeat. since even his better bowls, he found, could not simply be recreated through memory of what he had done right the time before. Somewhere around the 40th or 50th bowl, he could not say precisely which one, could not point to any single dramatic moment of breakthrough. Something in his hands began to know, without his conscious direction or deliberate thought, exactly how much pressure a given piece of clay required at each stage of its rising, exactly when to stop shaping and let the bowl simply be what it had already become, rather than continuing to push it towards some idealized form that existed only in his mind. "You did not learn to make a perfect bowl," Vishay told him afterward, some months into his apprenticeship, seeing the change in his work and, more importantly, in the ease with which he now approached the wheel each morning. "There is no such thing as a perfect bowl, only bowls that serve their purpose more or less gracefully. You learned through many unremarkable repetitions that felt, at the time, like simple failure, exactly how much effort each moment of the shaping actually required, not more, which would collapse the wall under its own excessive attention, and not less, which would leave it too thick and clumsy to rise properly into its intended shape. This cannot be taught directly, however much you might have wished for such direct instruction on your first day here. It can only be discovered, one ordinary bowl at a time, by someone willing to keep returning to the wheel without demanding that each attempt already be the masterpiece they eventually hope to produce." The apprentice, many years later, took on his own students and found himself, more than once, wanting to shortcut their learning by simply telling them what his own hands now knew wordlessly. The precise pressure, the exact moment to stop shaping. He discovered, to his mild frustration, that no amount of telling seemed to transfer the knowledge any faster than his own long apprenticeship had required. One student in particular, gifted and impatient in equal measure, grew visibly discouraged after weeks of lopsided, collapsing bowls, much as he himself once had. "Tell me exactly what you do with your hands in that last moment," she pleaded, "so I do not have to fail so many more times to find it." He considered her request seriously, wanting genuinely to help her if he could. "I could describe the pressure to you," he said slowly, "the way I might describe the taste of a particular fruit to someone who has never eaten it. But I do not think the words would put the taste in your mouth, any more than my description would put the right pressure in your hands. I am sorry to tell you there is no shortcut I know of. There is only the wheel and the clay and enough bowls between now and the day. Your hands simply know, the way mine eventually did, without either of us being able to say exactly when the knowing arrived." She did not look entirely comforted by this, but she returned to the wheel the next morning regardless, and the morning after that, and somewhere around her own 40th or 50th attempt, though neither of them could later agree on which one exactly, something in her hands too began at last to know. In a farming community that depended entirely on rice for its survival through the long year, the growing season followed an old and unhurried rhythm passed down through countless generations, months of intense coordinated labor during planting and harvest, when every hand in the village turned toward the fields from dawn until dusk, followed by long stretches where the fields were simply left to rest, fallow and quiet beneath the sky. and so were the farmers who tended them, their days slowing to a pace that visitors from busier places often found difficult to understand. A merchant visiting from a distant city, accustomed to labor that continued without pause throughout the entire year, driven by markets that never rested and competitors who never slept, was puzzled during his stay by the long fallow months he observed, the fields lying empty for what seemed to him a wasteful stretch of time. "Your fields could produce more," he told one of the farmers over a shared meal one evening, genuinely curious rather than critical, "if you worked them continuously rather than leaving them idle for so much of the year. In my city, we would never allow good land to sit unused for months at a time." The farmer considered this carefully, turning his rice bowl slowly in his hands as he thought. "We have tried that in years past," he said finally, "when the harvest was poor and we grew anxious for more, frightened by a lean season into believing that more constant labor was the only answer to our fear. We planted a second crop too soon after the first, before the soil had recovered what the first crop had drawn from it so thoroughly. The second crop was thin and sickly, hardly worth the labor we poured into it, and the soil, exhausted from having given without any chance to restore itself, gave us a poorer harvest the following year as well, since we had never allowed it the rest it needed to recover its full strength before we demanded more from it again. So rest for you is also a kind of labor, strange as that may sound. It is the labor of trusting that not all growth happens while you are visibly working, while your hands are in the soil and sweat is on your brow," the farmer said, gesturing toward the fallow fields visible beyond the window, quiet and brown beneath the evening sky. "The soil is doing something during the fallow months, even though nothing appears to be happening on its surface to an observer passing by, even though it looks, to an untrained eye, exactly like waste or neglect. We have simply learned, through much difficulty and more than one lean year, not to mistake that stillness for waste, however much it may resemble waste to someone unfamiliar with what is actually occurring beneath the surface." He gestured further to the fields beyond, some freshly harvested and now bare in the fading light, others already being carefully prepared for the next planting, the whole cycle visible at once from where they sat. "The same is true of a person," he added, refilling the merchant's tea. "There are seasons for the intense labor of practice, of striving towards some clear and worthy aim, when a person rightly gives everything they have toward that aim without holding back. And there are seasons where the wisest effort is simply to rest, to let what has been planted settle properly into you, to trust the slow, invisible work of integration and recovery, without immediately demanding another harvest before the last one has even been properly gathered in and understood." The merchant left the village some days later, still uncertain whether this unhurried rhythm produced less in the end than his own city's ceaseless labor, still inclined by his own upbringing to measure worth by visible activity. But the farmer, watching him go down the road toward the distant city, felt no particular need to convince him further of what he had said. The fields, in their own time, patient and indifferent to any single conversation, would continue to answer that question long after any words exchanged between two men over an evening meal had been forgotten by both. Some years later, the merchant returned to the region on other business and found himself, unexpectedly, drawn back to the same village curious to see whether its fields had fared as well as the farmer had claimed. He found the farmer much aged now, though still walking his fields each season with the same unhurried rhythm as before. The fallow months and the busy months following one another in the same old sequence. "I have thought of our conversation often," the merchant admitted, somewhat to his own surprise. "My own affairs in the years since have not allowed for such fallow seasons. I have worked without pause, believing all the while that pause was simply waste. I confess I am more tired now than I have any right to be at my age, and I find myself producing, some years, less than I once did, despite working harder than ever to prevent exactly that decline." The farmer said nothing triumphant in reply, offered no satisfaction at having been proven right. He simply refilled the merchant's tea and said, "The soil does not care whether a man believes in its need for rest. It simply grows thin regardless, if never given the season to recover. I suspect the same may be true of the man who tends it, whether or not he chooses to believe it of himself." The merchant sat with this for a long while, watching the same fallow fields he had once found so puzzling, and found this time that he understood the stillness there rather differently than he had on his first visit. An old teacher nearing the end of her long life, her hair entirely white now and her steps grown slow, was visited one autumn afternoon by a former student who had gone on, in the years since leaving her guidance, to establish his own small community of practice, known throughout the region for its discipline and rigor, for the visible seriousness with which its members pursued their training. "I have built something enduring," he told her, settling beside her mat with evident pride he did not trouble to hide, eager for her approval after so many years apart. "My students rise before dawn, every one of them, without exception. They observe strict schedules that leave no room for laxity. Nothing is left to chance or comfort in how we live and practice together." The old teacher listened to all of this without particular reaction, her expression giving away little of what she made of his account, and then asked a single question, quiet but direct. "Are they at peace?" The former student paused, visibly caught off guard, clearly not expecting this to be the measure by which his community's evident success would be weighed, having assumed she would ask instead about their discipline, their accomplishments, the reputation his community had earned in the wider region. "They are disciplined," he said carefully, choosing his words now with more caution than before. "They accomplish a great deal in their practice. Visitors are always impressed by what they observe." "That is not what I asked," she said, gently but without relenting, her eyes steady on his. He considered the question more honestly this time, sitting with it rather than reaching immediately for a reassuring answer, and admitted, slowly and with evident discomfort, that many of his students, despite their evident discipline and their impressive accomplishments, carried a visible tension he had noticed but not previously allowed himself to examine closely. A strain in their faces, even during meditation, when stillness should surely have brought some visible ease. A competitiveness with one another over whose practice appeared most rigorous, most impressive to visitors and to himself. An anxiety that seemed, the more he thought honestly about it, to have only deepened alongside their accomplishments, rather than easing as those accomplishments grew. "I fear," he admitted finally, his earlier pride now considerably diminished, that I have taught them to run very fast in a direction I never properly examined myself. So busy was I admiring how fast they were running. The old teacher nodded slowly, as though this admission itself, difficult as it clearly was for him to make, were the true measure of his progress, more meaningful to her than anything he had described before it, more meaningful even than the disciplined community he had built. Effort mistaken for its own purpose becomes simply another form of grasping, she said, her voice carrying the particular gentleness of someone who had made similar mistakes herself long ago before learning otherwise. The strain you describe in your students is the same string pulled too tight that nearly broke a young monk long ago before he learned, through great difficulty, to tune it properly. Discipline that produces peace is right effort. Discipline that merely produces more discipline, admired for its own intensity, and mistaken for progress simply because it is visible and impressive to others, is only a more respectable form of straining, dressed in robes that make it harder to recognize for what it is. The former student sat with this for a long while before speaking again, the autumn light shifting slowly across the floor between them. Then what should I teach them instead? If not the rigor I have spent so many years cultivating in them? Teach them, she said, to ask, as I have just asked you, and as you must now learn to ask yourself and them regularly, not merely whether they are accomplishing much, however impressive that accomplishment might appear to outside observers, but whether, beneath the accomplishment, they are becoming more at peace. If the answer is no, however hard that answer may be to accept after so much labor already invested, the effort itself, however impressive it may look from the outside, has been mistuned somewhere along the way. Loosen the string. Let the music, not the tension, finally become the measure by which you judge your community's progress. He returned to his own monastery some weeks later and gathered his students for an evening he had not previously held in all his years leading them. Not a lesson, not a recitation, simply a quiet asking, one by one, of the question his old teacher had posed to him. Are you at peace? Not are you disciplined? Not are you accomplished? Not are you impressive to visitors who pass through admiring your rigor? Are you, beneath all of it, at peace? The answers surprised him, though perhaps they should not have. Several students wept before they could finish speaking, having never once been asked this directly in all their years of rigorous training, having assumed, as he himself once had, that the question was somehow beside the point of a serious practice. Others admitted haltingly to a competitiveness among themselves they had been too ashamed to name aloud before that evening, afraid it would mark them as insufficiently devoted. He did not dismantle his community's discipline entirely in the months that followed. Some rigor, he had come to understand from his old teacher, was not itself the problem, but he began gradually to loosen certain strings that had clearly been pulled too tight, to make room for rest where rest had been quietly punished, to measure his students' progress by a gentler and truer standard than the one he had unknowingly taught them to chase. It was slower work than building the original discipline had been, but he found, watching his students in the seasons that followed, that the music, at last, had begun to sound rather more like the piece he had always intended it to produce. two young novices, close in age and arriving at the monastery within the same season, were once assigned the daily task of drawing water from a well some distance from their monastery, filling several large clay jars each morning for the kitchen before the day's other duties began. The first novice approached this task with visible reluctance each day, a reluctance that seemed to grow rather than fade with repetition, dragging his feet toward the well each morning, complaining under his breath about the distance and the weight of the jars, hurrying through the work as quickly as possible so as to be finished with it and move on to duties he considered more worthy of his time, often spilling half of what he drew in his haste and frustration, requiring extra trips that only compounded his resentment of the task. The second novice approached the same daily task quite differently, though not with any particular enthusiasm either, avoiding the trap of pretending to love a chore that was, in truth, simply ordinary labor, walking to the well at a steady, unhurried pace each morning, drawing the water carefully enough that little was spilled along the return journey, neither rushing through the task with visible contempt for it, as though the labor were somehow beneath him, nor dwelling on it as though it were some profound spiritual exercise deserving of special reverence, simply doing it plainly as the day's first small duty among many. An old monk who observed both of them for several weeks, curious about the different ways two young men could approach an identical task, eventually remarked on the difference to another teacher during their own evening walk together. The first novice resists the task and so exhausts himself twice over, the old monk observed, once through the labor itself, which is not so very demanding in truth, and once again through his resistance to it, which costs him far more than the water carrying ever could on its own. He arrives at his other duties each morning already tired, having spent as much energy fighting the water as carrying it, arriving depleted before his day has properly begun. And the second gives the task exactly the attention it requires, no more, treating it as some grand test of his character or spiritual worth that must be endured and later recounted, and no less, rushing through it with the contempt his fellow novice shows it daily. He finishes in roughly the same time each morning, spills very little of what he draws, and arrives at his other duties with his energy largely intact, because he did not spend any of that energy fighting something that required, in truth, only his steady and ordinary attention. The other teacher considered this observation for a while as they walked. So right effort is not only found in meditation halls and scripture, in the grand and visible practices we typically associate with a monk's devotion, she said finally. It is found equally at the well and in every other ordinary task that fills a day, the old monk agreed. The well does not care whether the one drawing its water considers the labor beneath him or above him, does not adjust its demands based on how a person feels about performing them. It only reveals, faithfully and without exception, exactly how much unnecessary suffering a person adds to an ordinary task through pointless resistance, and exactly how much ease becomes possible, but in that same task, when that resistance is finally quietly set down. The first novice, in time, noticed the pattern in himself, though it took considerably longer than it had taken the old monk observing him from a distance. It was not the water that changed him, in the end, but a small injury, a strained back from one particularly hurried and careless trip to the well, jars spilled and refilled twice in his haste, that left him unable to perform the task at all for several days, and forced him, for the first time, to simply watch his fellow novice perform it in his place. Watching from the sidelines, his own resentment momentarily quieted by physical discomfort, he noticed for the first time how little his companion's steady pace actually cost him, how the water carried itself, in a sense, once carried without complaint. He noticed, too, how much energy he had always spent, without quite realizing it, on the private argument he waged each morning against a task that required, in truth, so little argument at all. When his back had healed enough to return to the well himself, he found he could not quite return to his old hurried resentment, having seen so plainly what it had cost him and what its absence had cost his companion. He did not become overnight a man entirely at peace with every small duty asked of him, but he began that season to notice the resistance rising in him before it fully took hold, the way the old gatekeeper had once described noticing an unwelcome guest before it reached the door, and slowly, jar by jar, morning by morning, he set a little more of it down. At the base of a deep gorge, its walls rising smooth and steep on either side, a river had, over centuries beyond any single person's counting, worn a channel through solid stone, a channel so gradual, so unhurried in its shaping across vast stretches of time, that no single day's passage of water would ever have shown any visible change at all to even the most patient observer standing beside it. A young monk, frustrated after several years of what felt to him like fruitless meditation practice, his mind still wandering as freely as it had on his very first day of formal sitting, once sat beside this river with an old teacher who had brought him there specifically, without explanation beforehand, to simply observe the water and the stone together. "I have practiced for 3 years now," the young monk said, watching the water move past them with a restlessness that mirrored his own inner state. "And still, my mind wanders as much as ever, drifting to old memories, future worries, the smallest, irrelevant distractions, exactly as it did when I first sat down all those years ago. I begin to wonder if any progress is actually occurring at all in me, or whether I am simply repeating the same failed effort day after day without any real effect, deceiving myself that a spiritual path is unfolding when in truth nothing whatsoever has changed." The teacher gestured to the smooth stone channel surrounding them, its curves polished to a soft sheen by ages of passing water. "Do you think this stone gave way easily the first time water pressed against it? No, clearly it resisted for a very long time, being solid rock before ever yielding even slightly. And on any single day of the river's long passage through this gorge, say 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, or even simply last year, do you think a careful and patient observer, watching closely from dawn until dusk, would have been able to see the stone changing at all during that single day's observation?" The monk admitted after some thought that no, surely the change on any single day, however carefully observed, would have been entirely imperceptible to any human eye, however patient or attentive. "And yet the channel exists," the teacher said, gesturing at the gorge surrounding them, undeniable in its vast carved presence. Carved not by any single day's dramatic and visible effort, which never occurred at any point in this river's long history, but by the plain, unremarkable persistence of water continuing to do, each day without exception, exactly what water does by its nature, without anxiety about whether that particular day's passage was sufficient to show results, without despair that yesterday's passage failed to visibly finish the work it was slowly, invisibly accomplishing. The young monk looked at the channel around them with new eyes, seeing it now not as evidence of some singular, forceful event that had carved it in one dramatic stroke, but as the accumulated trace of a patience so vast it had never once needed to hurry, never once needed to prove its progress to any observer along the way, human or otherwise. Your mind is the stone, the teacher continued, watching the understanding settle slowly over the young monk's face. And your practice is the water, given faithfully day after day, regardless of whether any change is visible to you in the moment. You will not see the channel appear after any single sitting, however sincere or focused that sitting may be, just as no traveler standing beside this very river 1,000 years ago would have seen the gorge we now sit comfortably within. But the water does not stop flowing simply because the stone has not yet visibly yielded to it, does not grow discouraged and abandon its course because progress remains invisible for centuries at a time. It continues, faithfully and without complaint, trusting a scale of change too gradual for any single day or year or even lifetime to fully reveal. The monk sat beside the river a long while after this teaching had been offered, listening to water that had never once, in all its centuries of patient passage, needed to prove its own progress to anyone at all, least of all to itself. He returned to that same gorge many years later, an old man himself by then, his own students now grown, and some of them teaching in turn. He sat at the same spot beside the water and found to his quiet amusement that the stone around him looked to his eye almost exactly as it had on that first difficult visit. No visible change in the span of a single lifetime, precisely as his teacher had told him to expect. And yet he was not the same man who had once sat there, frustrated and doubting. His own mind over the intervening decades had worn its own channel, slowly and without any single dramatic day of transformation he could point to and call the moment of his awakening. The wandering was still there, some days more than others. He had never claimed otherwise to his own students, unwilling to promise them an arrival he himself had not fully reached. But the channel, however invisible its carving remained even to himself, was undeniably there now, in the quieter way his thoughts settled, in the patience that had, without his quite noticing when, become simply part of how he moved through an ordinary day. He thought, sitting there, of the young monk he had once been, so certain that 3 years without visible progress meant no progress at all, and felt for that young man not the impatience of a stranger, but the tenderness of someone remembering an old friend, grateful now that the young monk had stayed beside the river long enough all those years ago to learn that some kinds of progress simply cannot be measured on the scale of a single sitting, or a single season, or even a single glance backward across an entire lifetime. Many years after the night Sonar sat at the forest's edge, ready to abandon his practice entirely, his feet bandaged and his spirit exhausted by a devotion he had mistaken for strain, he had become himself an old teacher. Young monks now sought him out with the same question that had once quietly broken his own heart. How hard must I try? One evening, as dusk settled over the monastery and the first cool air moved through the trees, a young monk came to him with eyes dark from too many sleepless nights. "I have done everything I know," the young man said. "I sit longer than the others. I walk until my legs ache. I deny myself every comfort I can think of. Yet my mind grows tighter, not freer. If awakening is truly possible, why does it seem to move further away the harder I reach for it?" Sona listened without interruption. There was no need to hurry the young monk's words. He knew this landscape already. Once, many years before, he had walked through it himself. When the young monk finally fell silent, Sona smiled gently. "Tell me," he asked, "have you ever played an instrument?" The monk looked surprised. "A wooden flute," he answered after a moment. "When I was a child." "Then you already know something important." Sona rested his hands upon his knees and looked toward the darkening forest. "A reed forced too hard does not sing more beautifully. It only cracks. A string tightened beyond its nature does not produce a purer note. It only breaks." The evening breeze moved softly through the trees. "For many years," Sona continued, "I believed effort meant constant pressure. I believed every moment of ease was weakness. I thought peace had to be purchased through exhaustion." He smiled faintly. "I was wrong." The young monk waited. "Practice is not measured by how much pain you can endure," Sona said. "It is measured by how honestly you can return." He let the words settle between them. "Loosen the string," he said at last. "Not until it becomes lazy, only until it can finally sing." The young monk lowered his eyes. "And once I find the right tension, how do I keep it?" "You don't." The answer came so gently that, for a moment, the young monk wondered whether he had heard correctly. "You tune it again tomorrow." Sona looked toward the sky, where the first stars had begun to appear. "And the day after that." It had only waited patiently for him to stop demanding so much from himself. As he sat there, memories rose and faded without effort. A field quietly tended at dawn. A gate watched without fear. A single careful stroke of an axe. An old woman kneeling in unlikely soil. None of them had conquered anything. None of them had finished the work forever. Each had simply returned again and again, with enough care for one more day. Perhaps that had always been the music. Not perfection, not arrival, only the quiet willingness to tune the heart once more, whenever it had drifted from its true note. Darkness settled gently over the forest. The outlines of the trees softened until they became part of the night itself. Sona did not rise. He did not light a lamp. He did not feel that anything remained unfinished. The breeze passed softly through the branches. Somewhere, beyond the trees, water continued its patient journey toward the sea. And in that quiet, without striving for one more insight or one more achievement, the old monk simply listened. The music had never belonged to the string alone. It had always belonged to the listening, and for this evening, that was enough.